and I'm really proud of him, and excited to get your all's feedback, and hopefully you learn a little something from this too. So I'll leave it there and take it away. Thank you so much.
All right, and just a heads up, I did record this session. I had some requests, so I just hit record. So for display and training purposes, we are recording this session. So if you guys see anything crazy, it will be on record. Okay, so yeah, we're talking about diversity today, and how that impacts the workplace and how to make it work for everybody. We want people to be included, right? So without further ado, we'll dive right in. It's all about me right here. Here I am, and this is what I looked like 20 years ago. So I need a new headshot at some point here, because I'm no longer that skinny, handsome dude. I'm portly and rocking a beard these days. So all right, and enough about me. We'll get into the ground rules. So today we're going to cover the ground rules. We'll also get into demystifying diversity. We'll talk about the business case for DEIB, and we'll also talk about how diversity and talent acquisition kind of go hand in hand. We'll look at metrics and measures that will move the needle for diversity initiatives, and then we'll finish up with some closing thoughts. So the first one, you guys are all familiar with this slide if you've attended our CIB calls. The ground rules are going to be the same here. So we want to be patient with one another. We are all at different stages on our journey in diversity. None of us have it figured out. Nobody's mastered it. We're all on this journey together. And we want to also be open to learning. So there's a saying that once the dimensions of our mind are stretched, they never return back to their same dimensions or original shape. So we want to stretch our minds, we want to grow, and we don't want to be afraid to ask the tough questions. I say in jest at the outset that we're recording this, so don't say anything crazy, but actually this is a safe space. You can ask those tough questions, you can say things, and we're going to take it that everyone is acting and talking and sharing ideas in good faith and sincerity, and we're going to allow for that latitude as we have our discussions. And last but certainly not least, by all means, let your voice be heard. So this is open forum. If you have thoughts, ideas, raise your hand. We want to hear from you. All right, so the first stage, or the first step, we're going to demystify diversity. So we'll start with some of the basics. So what in the world is diversity? As we shared in our CIB call, Clarence Thomas had no idea what diversity was. So we're going to share a little bit and not assume that everybody knows. So diversity is all about recognizing and reducing biases whenever possible in an effort to grow a diverse and collective experience. And this is done through merit-based hiring. This isn't some sort of quota system or something that's going to rely on favorability for underrepresented populations, right? The equity part is something that seeks to level the playing field and to provide equal outcomes for everybody involved. And then inclusion seeks to help people feel secure and feel that they can be who they truly are, bringing their authentic self to the environment. And then last but certainly not least, we have the cousin of inclusion, which is belonging. And that's that emotional component that makes people feel like they actually fit in a place in an organization. All right, so bias. Bias is really the roadblock to diversity initiatives. It's one of the, if not the number one blocker of diversity, right? So there are two types of bias. There's explicit bias, or what's known as conscious bias. And this happens when a person is aware of their bias, but they're okay with that. They're comfortable enough to go so far as to make their feelings known outwardly. And then there's also the arguably the more impactful bias, and that is implicit bias, the unconscious bias, where we're not necessarily so aware of those biases that we have, and we all have them, and those are a little bit more difficult to address. So we'll talk about the two different types briefly. We'll just kind of look at explicit bias, and I'm going to share this video. This is an excellent example of explicit bias, and I'll share, and then we'll talk about it. Let me know if you can't hear the audio, but I'm going to play it here.
I don't hear the audio, Keenan. I don't know if anybody else can.
Yeah, so we could have an entire session just on that video alone. I mean, there's just so much to unpack. But, it's shocking at the outset that the teacher would admit this, but if he's in an environment, a safe space, and he feels like he can be open and share his feelings, is that something that we want to necessarily villainize, right? So this teacher was open about his bias, explicit bias, obviously. And at this point, I'd welcome thoughts from the team. Are there any takes from anyone on this? Because on one hand, his answers may be controversial, but on the other hand, if we were to truly want to move the needle and bring someone over to possibly the allyship position, we would hear him out and maybe say, okay, let's discuss it and let's really unpack what's going on. Any thoughts?
Yeah, Keenan.
Yeah.
Keenan, that was my thought too. Also, of course, if he coming out and saying that was as a part of an open dialogue for the class and a learning environment, but I didn't see it going that direction. And and I think that would have been a great learning and a teachable moment if he, as the teacher of the class, to lead the kids, especially that one young man who said, wow, I had respect for you, but now I don't anymore. So I think that would have been a great time for him to make it a teachable moment. But I, in my personal opinion is, I would rather for someone to tell me up front that they don't like me because I'm Black rather than to pretend to like me, to be honest with you. So that's my own personal plug.
Yeah, that's great. That's great. And I would tack on to say that there's a generational gap there too, right? Because his generation was brought up to think, take pride in your race and to think that you're superior. And by his thought process and by his upbringing, he just assumed that everybody else thinks the same way. But these kids are born in a different generation in a different time where it's more inclusive, and they've been taught to respect our differences and embrace them. Let's see, someone else had their hand up. Oh, Kat, yes.
I think Mary actually had her hand up first.
Oh, hey, Mary. Yeah. Please,
my hand
please.
up.
Yeah.
And I'm trying to remember what I was going to say. I thought it was interesting that he didn't address that he was racist. He was saying that he felt that his, like you were saying, Keenan, like kind of the generational shift, like he felt like his race was superior, that was how he thought, and that his assumption is everyone feels that way. And
Yeah.
I don't know that he was really like looking at it from a perspective of racism.
Yeah, I totally agree. Kat?
Yep. And I was going to mention that and to tack on to it the fact that it would be interesting to find out why. So you mentioned the generation difference and, what his upbringing had been, where the children are now in their upbringing, and helping them understand, is it not just because of race? Is it because of, just where you were in the formation of your thought process? And understanding the why behind it could help potentially bring him to that allyship side if he were open to hearing about it. It's my thoughts.
Very good. Kayla?
Yeah, I agree with everything everybody's saying, and my initial reaction to that video too is knowing your audience, and those children were quite young, and so to try to approach that conversation through the approach that he took probably wasn't the best way to try to bridge a conversation with his audience in that room. And it's really difficult to even interpret. You can make a lot of assumptions about where he was going with that conversation because you didn't even get to see his whole thought process in that short clip. So it's just an interesting video.
Yeah, absolutely. And you raise a great point, guys. We don't know the context. It was a short clip of the video. We don't understand the context of the situation, but unfortunately, based on that video, it went viral, and the school took measures. They suspended the teacher immediately, and I believe he eventually was terminated. And is that really the direction that we want to go in when we're talking about diversity and we're really trying to bring people in to be included in the conversation rather than excluded? Did you have another question, Kat, or you just still have your hand up?
I just forgot to put it down.
Okay. All right. Very good. So we'll move on then. So implicit bias, there are so many forms of implicit bias. Gosh, so where do we start? So there's the common implicit bias, and when it comes to implicit or unconscious bias, there's the common ones, right? Race, ethnicity, gender, things of that nature. And that's really, truly just the tip of the iceberg. There are so many countless forms of implicit bias categorizations that we could spend the entire conversation here and not exhaust them, right? There's hundreds of them. And I've included some of them here, and you see it goes off the page. So that just kind of gives you the indication that underneath that tip of the iceberg is a much deeper level of categorizations that we could possibly talk about. So with that said, we're going to put people to the test here, and I'm going to play this video. I want you to, as the video plays, see if you can spot the bias. So we think we know bias, and we'll review and look at this diversity hiring exercise. And afterwards, we'll circle back and we'll see how you did with spotting the biases in this video. Okay, so we can see in that hiring process, there's a whole bunch of bias going around, right? Looking at some of the bias that was, we can call it out here. So like even at the outset, the candidate was observing that, man, there's a lot of white guys here. So there's racial bias. We go into it and we look a little bit further. You have the gentleman as he's interviewing the young lady. He says, "Hey, what would you think about spearheading Taco Tuesday?" Assuming that she's Hispanic, there's a stereotype bias that he brings into the fold. Um, Digging into it a little bit further, you look at the other interviewer and asking, we want to broaden our minds, we want different life experiences, and then goes and talks about RuPaul's Drag Race and his experience, of course, alluding to being homosexual. And then, of course, that's a sexual orientation bias that's introduced. And then you look at ethnicity bias that's been introduced, asking what people are your peoples. Unpacking it a little bit further, you go into the can I touch your hair? Again, racial bias, over the top ridiculous, but sometimes satire is a good way to point out some of the pitfalls that happen during a hiring process. And then, of course, again, stereotype Drag Race being, assuming that if he is homosexual, you must surely watch RuPaul's Drag Race. And one that I thought was fairly humorous was the beauty bias, right? So they were both talking and he said, I would make out with any guy. And she says, even that guy. So this guy got pulled into it with the beauty bias unintentionally. And then, the classic, of course, the guy is offered more money than the woman. So we see a gender bias presenting itself. And then the craziest bias of all is the OMG bias. When this guy just says, hey, if they want diversity here, I'll death drop to the floor and throw a piece of fried chicken in my mouth. So I call that the OMG bias because there's just no words for that. So when it comes to diversity, if you subtract equity, you take inclusion and belonging out of the equation, then you wind up with what's known as a token. And I have in my hand here, you might not be able to see it because of, there we go. But a token, asking the group here, no hands needed, just anyone can shout out, how much is this token worth? What's the value? Anybody? No clear set value, right? I mean, unless you're at a Chuck E. Cheese, it's hard to determine what value this is going to have, right? If you were to, if I were to ask that same question and I pull a quarter out and I show a quarter, what's the value of a quarter? Anybody? Going to be 25 cents, right? It's a quarter. Simple enough. Everybody agrees upon the value of a quarter. Well, consider that true diversity, it starts with a mutually understood merit-based value that a person brings to the organization. So when that person has an agreed upon value and they're hired on merit, we can see that that is much more valuable across the board than, say, a token hire would be. By the video that we just saw, they would be bringing in a token hire. Obviously, they did not ask merit-based questions in the interview process, and they didn't really get to know the candidate and the experiences, the skills, and the knowledge that they would bring to the table. They were more focused on just making sure that they got a diversity hire in the door. All right, so, going and talking about bias and how do we mitigate bias? So we have to first accept that we all have unconscious bias. Some of us have conscious bias, and we just have to come to terms with that. We have to appreciate that stereotyping is the foundation for most forms of bias. And we want to be sure that we promote a free and open dialogue and giving that space and grace and presenting folks with a judgment-free zone. And then last but certainly not least, if there is interest in understanding how to mitigate bias or even detect it rather, there is a associations test, the IAT, implicit associations test, and that's something that Harvard's put together. And it's a good way to kind of put yourself to the test and see where your biases might be. Following up that bias conversation, so there is what's called the wheel of power and privilege. This was something that was done by Sylvia Duckworth, and this is something called intersectionality. Within the wheel there, we can see that there is a power dynamic at the center of the wheel, or the hub. And then outside of that power dynamic is the marginalized population. So intersectionality is really the acknowledgement that people have layers. You know, we're not necessarily just one thing. So I might not be just simply Christian. I may be Christian and combine that with being someone that's not white, right? Or a race other than what's white. So I would put me outside of that power dynamic. Or on the other hand, another example would be, say, a woman could be Muslim, and she might be at the same time a woman, of course, and she may be immigration status. She may be someone that migrated to the country. So if she's discriminated against, what is it really that is the cause and the heart of that discrimination? And it's unpacking that and understanding that people are discriminated against with different factors. It could be race, it could be gender, it could be any number of things. And that intersectionality makes up who we are. So I gave the example of the Muslim woman wearing a hijab, discriminated against. It would be impossible to really dislocate or disassociate her gender from her religion and identity. So being able to unpack that is can be challenging. So what are the consequences, right? If we don't take intersectionality under consideration, some of the challenges can be or the consequences of that could be a greater wage inequality, for one. It could be the lack of professional development for that individual. It could also present hiring discrimination inequities. And it could also mean increased sexual harassment in some instances, and even higher turnover rates. So those are some of the consequences if intersectionality is not taken into consideration. So in this slide, it's great. We all think that DEIB is wonderful, but not everyone does, and believe it or not, Gardner has done a study and has taken into consideration the pushback and real genuine feelings about DEIB. And although it's increased, there's also some opposition to DEIB. And according to the research that's been presented by Gardner, 44% of employees feel alienated by DEIB. You have another 42% that believe that DEIB is divisive. And you have another 42% that they even resist or resent DEIB efforts. So understanding that, it kind of helps to unpack that, and Gartner's done that, and they've put it in a 3D framework here, categorizing pushback. So their first category is denial. And denial would be a response from somebody that would simply say, this isn't a problem until you brought it up, is an example of somebody saying, another thing that they might say in denial is saying that I'm colorblind. I don't necessarily see race, and it's not something that's a problem for me. So there's the denial, and understanding how to address those types of questions will certainly help bring people into the fold. There's also disengagement, right? So in the disengagement, folks may just shut down, saying that they just fear saying the wrong thing. If I say the wrong thing, like we saw the instructor, we may get fired, and there may be some real consequences. So there is a fear element to participating and being genuine and participating in DEIB. Others may say that I'm just simply too busy to engage and dismiss it altogether. And then there's the derailment, right? So there's derailment or whataboutisms. We'll talk about DEIB, you raise the subject, but what about inflation? Isn't that a much weightier problem? Or you may have some pushback in just saying that, diversity, that's really reverse discrimination, not something I'd be interested in. So these are some of the counterpoints, counter arguments, and I just wanted to put that out there so that you're aware of them and can understand where these folks might be coming from and understand how to address it. All right, so digging into the business case for DEIB. So there's a case to be made, and there's definitely rationale behind DEIB. So we'll take a moment to look at these business cases. When employees trust that they are going to be treated fairly, they're going to be 6 times more likely to take pride in their work. They're going to be 10 times more likely to even look forward to going to work, and they're going to be 5 times more likely to stick around. So these are some real impacts of a true DEIB culture. There's also some business benefits to DEIB, which I was touching on. It's going to help employees feel safe. They're going to be respected, and they're going to feel connected to the organization. It's also going to increase empathy, which translates into increased team building. And diverse cultures, they will reach a wider audience. And also diversity, believe it or not, it can combat that malaise that folks will get or feel from a work from home burnout. And then last but certainly not the least, it's just, darn it, it's just the right thing to do. So looking at some of these business benefits, one is going to be reduced liability. Discrimination and similar lawsuits, they can be quite expensive, going anywhere from $20,000 to hundreds of thousands of dollars. So having an effective DEIB program in place is going to help people be more cognizant of diversity and more sensitive to diversity, and therefore you'll be able to avoid those lawsuits that can crop up. Another advantage is lower compliance costs. HR will spend hours dealing with complaints. They'll have hours spent trying to deal with complex laws and legal issues and compliances. And having an effective DEIB program in place will help reduce that number of hours that HR is pulling their hair out around these issues. There is also a greater availability of talent. So if you're tapping into a broader pool of talent, that's going to reduce your time to hire, which is a benefit to the bottom line. There's also improved employee engagement. So low engagement rates will hurt productivity and retention, but if you have a good DEIB program in place, that's going to actually bolster your productivity, and it's going to help your retention rates. And faster innovation, big plus here, respect for different perspectives, that just unleashes the power of innovation among teams. And we also see that reduced employee turnover. So employees with a higher morale are going to be more productive. They're going to be more likely to stick around. And then last but certainly not least, studies have shown that DEIB organizations are 8x more likely to have better business outcomes. All right, so diversity and talent acquisition. This is something near and dear to my heart, being a recruiter and in talent acquisition. So we'll talk about this a minute. So we'll start by just dismissing and dispelling some misconceptions about diversity. I shared in the slide earlier that not everybody is on board with diversity, and part of that is due to the fact that there are some prevailing misconceptions about diversity. Diversity recruiting seeks to address historical underrepresented populations within the workplace. So the misperception might be that diversity is just this blanket strategy to recruit brown people. Well, it's not. So this may be part of it, but it is certainly not all of it.
Yeah.
Diversity recruiting is not a quota system, and it's important to note that. One of the things that I use as a for instance, when I first joined Helios, it was a woman-owned business, and 95% of the staff were women. So I was a diversity hire, but not necessarily for obvious reasons. I was of course, a man coming into a system predominantly women, and so that in combination with my ethnicity made me a diversity hire. So we're looking at that intersectionality, right? So pulling from that again. So it's not a quota system, and in fact, quota systems are illegal. So I just will point that out as well. Diversity also in recruiting, it is some have said it's reverse discrimination, as I shared one of the arguments here, and it's truly not reverse discrimination. Reverse discrimination is the practice or policy of showing preference to individuals belonging to groups known to have been discriminated against in the past. And it's truly a recruiter's goal in diversity recruitment to fill the candidate and within that talent pool, or to bring the talent pool in and introduce diversity in that pool of candidates. It's up to the hiring team ultimately to make those hiring decisions, and that's where the decisions rest. So while recruiting will work on diversity in terms of bringing and introducing talent that is diverse, the ultimate hiring decision is based on merit, and that's up to the hiring team. Recruiting is not a leg up or a handout. Underrepresented populations, they don't want handouts. They don't want a hand up or some sort of preferential treatment. They want to be hired on merit. They don't want to be a token, as I just showed and illustrated. They want to be a contributing member of the team. And hiring based on merit is how that happens, not on giving preferential treatment to any sort of group. And then the argument that diversity lowers recruiting quality or candidate quality is certainly not true. Diversity does not prevent meritocracy, it rather enhances it. It levels the playing field so that individuals all have fair access to demonstrate their abilities, their skills, and their experience. All right, so diversity recruitment PowerPoints. Clients often will ask and they'll say, how do we get started? How do we add diversity to the workplace? But the problem is a lack of understanding in that recruiters source to their comfort level. So it's much bigger than sourcing. It's dealing with some of these other underlying issues. Recruiters also tend to go with what the hiring manager is telling them to follow, and they march to those orders. Even if there's baked in bias in there, they'll tend to just go along with it. Understanding also that there's no silver bullet, and that's one of the things that is problematic, is that they think, or clients will say, if I just go to an HBCU, or if I just do this one thing or the other, diversity solved. And nothing could be further from the truth. It's much more complex than that. Yeah, so why going to an HBCU and simply hiring a diversity person is not necessarily wrong. It's not going to solve the problem. Inequity goes much deeper than that. It's embedded, and it goes beyond just simply sourcing. Success for increasing diversity really requires a concerted effort. And while the HBCUs might provide that pool of talent, and certainly can help diversity, but we also need to seek out talent that is based on the hiring process. And we need to detect those biases contained within that hiring process and seek to remove them. Many will say that, well, the hiring system is broken. And here's where I disagree, right? So the hiring system isn't broken. In fact, if you were to really peel back the layers and understand that for 4 centuries, the hiring system has been working according to plan. It wasn't until 1964 in the Civil Rights Act that practices of discrimination and bias were made illegal. So you had a long ramp and runway of these hiring practices being put into place that were intentionally exclusionary. So yeah, the system works just fine. It isn't broken. It's working as it was set up to be. What we have to remember is that it's going to take time to unpack and undo all of those bad practices that were established over the centuries and replace them with good ones. So diversity recruiting and increasing diversity, it just doesn't happen overnight. It's a process, it's a journey. So increasing diversity is something that will take time. You can't do a one and done and say that it's over, right? There's no victory or immediate win here. It's a series of victories over time and it's a process, a journey. And then last but certainly not least, in diversity is binary. It's not directional. It's not black or white. It's not we have everything figured out and wipe our hands, we're done with it. It's actually more like walking toward a horizon. You're walking towards it, but you never arrive. It's a continuous process of policies, practices, and behavior shifting. And got the Q code here. If you're interested, we definitely have a place to get started at Helios. You can download the checklist and we can help you out in that respect. So moving on, when contemplating a DEIB strategy, some simple rules apply. And I would say one prevailing rule you want to take into consideration, and that's EWA. Environment always wins. A workplace environment plays an essential part in the overall happiness and job satisfaction for employees. So you want to be sure that you're asking questions, asking the right questions that's going to underscore that simple rule, right? So one, who does your work environment most benefit is one question that you might want to ask when you're formulating the strategy. Who do you have to be in order to experience this great work environment? Who does your workplace enable to bring their whole self to work without feeling like they need to assimilate? Who gets to see themselves in leadership roles? Who feels included on the team? Who has a voice that actually gets heard within an organization? And who gets that fair access to opportunities? So answering these types of questions is a great way to begin formulating a mission and heading toward a more diverse work culture. So I put here together some building blocks of putting together a DEIB strategy for organizations. So one, you want to start with that mission. Asking those questions that I just mentioned will help with putting together some due diligence, some introspection. And again, that sheet downloadable that I mentioned for the checklist certainly can contribute to building that mission. And you want to keep your 3 Ps in mind, right? Planning, preparation, and process. And then moving to data. You know, one of the things that you want to make sure that you do is you track your progress, because you can't really track progress unless you understand where you're coming from and what those data points are. So target specific areas for improvement, and then that way you'll be better able to see your progress and metric your results. Absolutely must need buy-in from the executive team, from the decision makers, and you have to have them on board. Without it, that your DE boat's going to sink before it even leaves the port. So you want to be able to clearly articulate the business benefits of DEIB, and then accountability. And that's something that is very important to any program, and you need that discipline. It's essential to making progress. And if there is a lack of discipline, then that's going to engender a lack of priority. It no longer becomes important, and that leads to a lack of intentionality, which is going to be counterproductive to any efforts. So for a second here, let's take a look at how things kind of flow down in terms of the recruiting process. You have your employee brand, which is a focal point in 3 different areas. You want to look at your employee brand here, and that employer branding goes into social media, into your website, into all different types of communication that you have externally, and that's important to have that in place. You also want to consider prospecting and sourcing. Boolean strings that are intentional are a great way to proactively reach out to underrepresented groups. Also considering attending networks or large events, and having social media engagement is another great way of being proactive. And then there's the referrals, and having referral programs. As I mentioned before, being one of the few men that was introduced into Helios at the time, more have joined, and that's been a result in a large part of referrals coming in from fellow employees. You also have employee resource groups, which are a great resource. And again, Helios is a great example of boomerangs. Periodically, if you ping people and invite them back that have left the organization, the grass is not always greener on the other side. In fact, as the saying goes, the grass is always greener where there's more fertilizer. So, some people will try something out and say, hey, Helios was a pretty good environment. Let me come back. And luckily, our organization has been gracious enough to accept a number of people back after they've departed. All right, writing a job description. This is a pain point. I've seen with a number of clients that when it comes to job description, it's more of an afterthought. It's like, gosh, I got to write this job description. But instead of looking at it as a pain, they should be welcoming it as an opportunity. Because if you think about it, underrepresented people, they're going to want to feel, well, let's look at it this way. How does that job description make them feel? If I read that job description, am I going to feel welcomed? Am I going to feel like I'll be appreciated? Or is it going to be the opposite? Am I going to feel uninvited to the recruiting process? So this is a great opportunity to really set the tone for your organization and just show that candidate how open and diverse your company truly is and what you embrace in terms of your principles and what you're looking for within the organization. So some of the examples of where we might go wrong unintentionally in a job description: putting words in like chairman or including salesman instead of salesperson, a common mistake, and not as common as it was. We're getting better about that, but that's an unconscious bias that we might find in a job title. You want to avoid unconscious gender bias, right? So there are certain words, certain language that doesn't poll well with women versus men. Aggressively pursuing the #1 position in cryptocurrency is a bit strong, and it's not gender neutral language. So being aware of opportunities to kind of soften the language or make it more agreeable for a wider gender audience, right? You want to avoid bias against languages, English as a second language. In some instances, you might see English as a native speaker, something like that, and have someone that's really capable second guessing themselves because maybe they are from a different culture or speak a different language or have an accent. So it could be missing out on good candidates as a result of including something like that. And then there's also the affinity bias, right? This is one that pops up quite a bit. You want somebody from a top engineering school or Harvard or something like that, and saying that you want the best of the best, but that's an affinity bias that sometimes will exclude very capable candidates. And then there's also age bias. If you include in your job description, and we're looking for a digital native. Well, I'm an old guy. I've been born well before some of these applications were even available or before the internet came around. So if you say that, I might feel like, well, I'm not really native. I was born well before all of this happened, so I'm not really native to it. So you may be excluding some candidates based on age bias with writing your job description in this way. Talking about going back to the importance of diversity recruiting, here are some tips or some traits of highly effective diversity recruiters. They're going to take the time to study workforce demographics compared to the workplace. They're also going to look and they're going to form highly effective partnerships within an organization. They also tend to hone their cultural competence, awareness, and they're always increasing their knowledge. They also tend to engage with leaders and decision makers on a regular basis. They also find systematic barriers within the hiring process, and they try to remove them as they come up. And then they also tend to show proof of diversity and inclusion to job seekers. So if you have advertising out there about on your website showing your diversity, if you have a LinkedIn page that really showcases your diversity, a good diversity job seeker are going to bring those proof points up. And, last but certainly not least is that they monitor their own performance against key metrics that are going to show that they are making a difference and moving the needle. So, congratulations if you've crafted the world's most inclusive job description and shared it with the universe. But if you don't have intentionality behind it, if you don't have a core group of people that are tuned in, and recruiters that are tuned in and doing these things, then your field of dreams approach with the job description, that's just not going to be realistic. All right, and here's a few pointers, just sharing with DEIB sourcing tips. So going to certain job sites, expanding that, certainly helpful. They have specialized sites out there, Senior Job Bank, Blacks in Technology, military career sites. There's a number of them out there. Boolean searches, I mentioned earlier, great way. And if you're interested in getting your team trained up, AIRS is a great program in diversity hiring. I've taken it myself, and it really does an excellent job of showing how to do creative Boolean searches to find those diverse candidates. And then there's networking, and going to some of these career networks or attending them or sponsoring events. The Boomerang employees, great networking, and definitely something that you want to keep in mind as well. All right, let's talk about measures that move the needle. So DEIB, as I mentioned, can be like walking towards a horizon. No matter how long you're walking or how far, you never actually arrive. So measuring meaningful progress is going to be the thing that keeps us motivated here. So at this point, going to see if people are paying attention here. We're going to put folks to the test. We're going to have a pop quiz. So surprise, surprise. We're going to pretend that we're part of a brainstorming session and that we're trying to come up with a good plan for diversity and coming up with a program, right? So here are some of the questions or some of the ideas that were put on the table. So yes or no, the first question here, and feel free to chime in, answer the question. Yes or no, good idea, bad idea, increasing the number of Black or Hispanic employees by 15% by year end. Would you say that that is a good idea or maybe not so good? 50-50 chance, valuable cash and prizes on the table.
Not so good.
You're going to say not so good or good?
Not so good.
Okay, so the answer is no. Yes, while increasing employment numbers for a particular underrepresented group, it's a well-intentioned goal, but this example could be and probably is a quota, which is considered a niche. So yeah, good call. How about the second one? Select 3 recruiting channels that target Blacks and Hispanics. Would this be a good idea or not so good?
Good idea.
All right. Yeah, so we got some thumbs up, and yes, this helps to create a pipeline that targets specific underrepresented populations. If you're trying to turn the corner and you're trying to achieve that 15% of Black and Hispanic employees by the year end, this is a good way to do it because you're able to intentionally fill your pipeline with these candidates and making sure that they're qualified candidates that have a shot that may not have otherwise at landing the job and be hired based on merit rather than their melanin count, right? So this next question, since the candidate is Black, let's have Tyrone talk to this candidate during the interview. Good idea, bad idea? Yeah, I think that's going to be a bad idea, right? So while Erica Badu might strongly suggest calling Tyrone, that's not something that we would want to do as an organization. Tyrone might not feel exactly comfortable if the only time he's tapped to attend an interview is that the person's Black, right? What about this question of using benchmarking to determine pay parity among peers? Is that a good idea? Yeah, we got some yeses there. Absolutely. Benchmarking pays particular attention to underrepresented groups, and doing that is an excellent way to ensure that, like the video we saw earlier, where the person was taken aback by how much the guy was making versus what she was offered, right? So we want to avoid those situations. And then last but certainly not least, is it a good idea, bad idea to track employee retention numbers segmented by age, gender, or race? All right, we got a yes there. Absolutely, yes, tracking segmented employee retention will assist in creating data-driven diversity and help with your diversity initiative. All right, so the answer to that last pop quiz question is a great segue for finding data points that focus on an organization's diversity deficits, right? And this is fertile ground for growing a diversity program. Data is important to any business, and there's no exception here with DEIB. So figuring out those data points that are going to be able to best track or begin with asking, it all begins with asking the right questions, bottom line. So questions like, who do you employ today? What employees are you retaining? You want to look at your who's leaving your organization and for what reasons. The exit interviews can be telling sometimes. You also want to consider which employees are you developing, which employees are being advancing throughout the organization, and then asking yourself, what talent do you want to attract? So these are all questions that can help with figuring out your data points and what you want to really put a focus and shine a spotlight on. All right, so looking at some metrics, additional metrics, there's no shortage of possible metrics here, but here are top 10 suggestions that I'm going to put forth here. It's you have to keep in mind that a DEIB is never a one size fits all. It's going to be different for every organization, and those metrics that they want to track will be varied. So number one, demographics across organizational levels. It often happens that an organization can be diverse at some of the lower levels, but then when you look at the upper rungs of the representation, that tends to fall off in some instances. So, really pay attention, calculate the demographics all the way across the organization, not just within certain pools. You want to also look at retention of employees across all of those groups as well. So paying attention and drilling down into that retention data is going to help you uncover if there's any retention issues with particular groups of employees. You also want to keep an eye on that employee turnover, like we mentioned. Look at those percentage rates, who's sticking and staying and who's actually leaving and walking out the door, and understanding why. Having those general interview questions, exit interviews, can be helpful at trying to figure out just exactly why people are leaving. Adverse impact. You want to calculate the adverse impact, which allows you to measure the potential impact at each stage of the employee's life cycle. And that way you're going to be able to address issues as they arise. It identifies discriminatory practices ultimately that are made within the hiring process and the HR process, and just makes things fairer for everyone. Also looking at candidate demographics. This is one of the top 7 things that your diversity recruiters are going to do. They're going to figure out what candidates that are being attracted to the organization, what sources are they coming from, how diverse talent progressing, how are they progressing through the pipeline funnel, things of that nature. That's going to give you, that's a good metric to track and really understand how you're doing. Advancing employees, who gets promoted, who doesn't. Equal pay equity, big thing to track, and also tapping into your resource groups. Employee resource groups are a great sounding board for diversity as well. And one of the things that we do here at Helios, of course, is and we just recently completed this exercise, is that employee net promoter score. Another great practice and a great way to keep your finger on the pulse of diversity. And then also initiative-focused DEI metrics. These metrics can measure outcomes for specific programs, for specific data points that you want to really see how you're doing and performing in. So these are the top 10 initiatives there. And I know we're getting close to the end here, and I'm wrapping up, coming in for a landing. So with workplace diversity, it started in the 60s, and it was a lot of civil unrest in the 60s. It wasn't happy days for everyone. It was a volatile, transformative period in U.S. history, but as a result, we came up with EEO and affirmative action legislation, which actually caused us to rethink and step back and understand that we do need a more integrated office and workspace. And that awareness didn't stop in the 60s. We see a heightened awareness as of late with some social pressures and demand and outcries for social justice. And that has brought diversity back to the forefront and back to the front of people's minds, where we're making additional progress and we're working to do better. And then beyond those societal situations, we also have the financial incentives. So in a capitalistic society, the bottom line is the bottom line. And we had a really interesting exhaustive study in 2015 from McKinsey and Company that really did an excellent job of pointing out how diversity does impact the profitability of organizations. So investing in DEIB is great for the organization and can be, we'll cover 4 aspects here. So one of the advantages is in talent acquisition. You're going to have a bigger pool to choose from. You're going to shorten the life cycle of those roles being open. Increases employee satisfaction, and you have better alignment with your customer base and improved decision making all through the corporate innovation process. When you have more perspectives, you're going to have more innovation. Yeah. All right, so I will say in closing that we're not all in the same boat. However, we all are in the same storm. Some of us are in yachts. Some of us are in sailboats. Some of us are in fishing boats, while others may be paddling along in a kayak. Some of us are swimming along while others are drowning. So we want to offer a hand to those that are drowning and an oar to those swimming. And that's where allyship comes in. And that is another discussion for another now. So with that said, any questions, comments as we wrap up? I know we're right at the hour and going a little bit over. Any questions or comments? If not,
I think it was wonderful, okay. Keenan.
Oh, thank you so much. Thank you so much. So as we're exiting here, I want to be sensitive to people's time. There is one last video that's thought provoking that I would like to share. It's only a couple of minutes long, so I'll share this and have that as a parting thought for us. Yeah, so the key takeaway, diversity matters, and we can all do something to help diversity flourish. It's when we choose to do nothing that diversity tends to wither and die. So thank you all for your time this afternoon. Appreciate everyone's time, and we went a little bit over, but if you have clients out there that need some help with diversity, we can certainly be a resource. We also do other things, as you know, and we do them well. And so spread the love, spread the word.
Thank you, Keenan. I noticed you added a few new things in there, and that was fun to see. So thanks so much for your time. If anybody has feedback, please, we would love for you to share that with Keenan and I so we can incorporate that going forward. And appreciate your time here. Hope you learned something new. And thank you again, Keenan.
All right, thank you.
Thank you, Keenan.
Thanks, Keenan.
Hey,
Great job, guys.
Natalie,
Looks beautiful. Looks amazing. Thank you so much.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Can we have a copy of the
Slide deck?
of the slide deck? I mean, I won't send it to anybody, but I would love to have it just as a reference. All the information was great, certainly about the job descriptions and those kinds of things, because we are all having conversations with our clients, many of them about DE&I.
Yeah, absolutely. So I believe we will have a couple of webinars on this. We're gonna just hone it a little bit, and but we'll share it internally. I would prefer probably you don't share it externally yet,
Yeah,
just
we
because I want to do webinars on it. But we will invite our clients to those, and certainly happy to share this. We can send it out, in the next week or so.
Perfect. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Keenan. It was
All right,
wonderful.
thank
You're
you,
a wonderful
everyone.
speaker. Well, you're gonna have to do it
Thank you.
again.
Yeah, my pleasure. I enjoy it. It's a labor of love.
He's a natural at it, huh?
Yeah, no kidding. Right.
Bye, everybody. Thanks again.
Bye.